First off, before we even get started, I just want to say that, with everything that's happened over the past year and a half, being in a room filled with a bunch of people who are excited to listen, to hear what's going on, to see what's going on in tech is amazing. So give yourselves a round of applause. So my name is PJ Hagerty. I work at a place called Mattermost. Let's see if my clicker's going to work. It's not. Cool. So I work at a place called Mattermost. We do developer collaboration software. If you want to know more, come and check out our booth. We've got a booth outside. You can scan our QR code. We'll send swag straight to your house. It's really cool. We've got a lot of neat features that'll help your teams. That's not actually what I'm here to talk about, but let me get to my favorite subject, which is me. I'm a developer advocate. As you can tell from my extremely thick accent that's probably super hard to understand, I'm from a country called America. You may have heard of it. We're generally in the news quite often. I'm sorry about that. It's not my fault, but not being a developer advocate means that I'm very lucky. I get to go around the world talking about technology, talking to different people, getting different perspectives, and learning about what other people do. Beyond that, I'm a dad. I used to coach hockey. I've been playing drums since I was 6 years old. I play in bands. And one time, and it was actually 8 years ago yesterday, I let my 11-year-old keynote RubyConf. Don't do that. Just a piece of advice. Don't ever bring a child on stage. They will take the spotlight like you wouldn't believe. But that's not what the talk is about. What this talk is about is buying a better clicker. There we go. So the main focus of this talk is kind of 3 parts. So there are a lot of misconceptions about programming languages and identity. It's the different things that we use, the tools that we use at work, we think a lot of times define who we are, or that one is better than another in some kind of golden hammer, ecclesiastical kind of way, like something's going to be so much better just because we decided it or our company decided it or we've been using it for years. It's what we learned. That's not always true. Some of these misconceptions come from the communities that we work with or identify with, and some of them are from the communities that spawned us. Finally, there's also some kind of perceptions about open source and the enterprise and what those things mean. Are you an enterprise developer? Are you an open source developer? Are you a project developer? So we're going to look at all these things. So if you saw the title of the talk, Urban Legends, and you thought we were going to talk about like cryptozoology and weird stuff, we're not going to be actually talking about that. There are no Loch Ness Monster, no chupacabras, nothing like that. So no actual urban legends, but we're going to talk about perceptions. So let's get into it. We're going to start with Ruby. How many people have used Ruby before? How many people loved it? Wow, hands went down and other hands went up. How did you love it and not use it? That's a question for you. We can talk about that some other time. But like to me, Ruby, when I came to Ruby, I had been an enterprise developer for a while doing mostly Microsoft technologies. I was programming in Visual Fox Pro. Any Visual Fox Pro users out there? Yeah, I didn't think so. Yeah, you probably know what it is, but you probably don't want to use it or admit to it. But I came to Ruby and I was very excited about it. Like this was such a great concept, a programming language developed by programmers to help programmers be happy. Developers and happiness. It was not really a concept that was out there in the world at the time. It was the 1990s, but a lot of people at the time thought that, and still think this, Ruby's kind of a hipster thing for the kids these days, and they use it at boot camps. And why is that? Generally, because of Rails. So Rails, for those of you who haven't used Ruby, is a framework that allows you to use Ruby on the web. That's kind of important since most of what we do is on the web these days. But the problem with Ruby and Rails is it's not actually a mutually exclusive deal. Rails is well known because it has this guy who created it. His name is David Heinemeier Hansen. He is a very opinionated guy, but people need to divorce the idea that Ruby and Rails are the same thing. Ruby is a beautiful, well-written, easy to use, easy to learn programming language. Rails is simply a web framework that is built in Ruby that allows you to put Ruby on the web. These two things are not the same. People don't seem to understand that they are not the same. So to give a perfect example, I do a lot of side projects in my spare time, and I use a lot of Ruby because I love it, and it's a lot of fun, and it's super easy to get set up, but I almost never use Rails. I don't need it. I'm not building I'm not building the next Silicon Valley startup. It's not really a big deal. I can use Sinatra or any of the other frameworks that come along with Ruby. It's not such a big deal. Rails gets so much coverage that people don't realize that there's really a whole other side of it. Right now, RubyConf is going on in Denver. Those developers, a lot of them never use Rails. They focus on Ruby and the other parts of the ecosystem that are good. So it's not all about DHH and the weird things that he says on Twitter, because he says a lot of weird shit. But it is easy to use. It is easy to scaffold using Rails. I don't want to poop on Rails and say it's a terrible, terrible thing, but the perception of the community is generally through that. Rubyists are hipsters. They are, you know, little developers that make terrible applications that are not great. So I'm going to let this sink in for a second. This was taken from a blog post that wanted to claim that enterprise software is not dead. Well, obviously, but we'll get to the whole dead thing in a little bit. The idea was that people who use open source, and at the time Ruby was pretty popular, people who use open source are developing applications that don't matter. And I'm going to get more into that perception later. But this was the key thing. And I thought it was interesting because your representation of an open source developer is a guy with a beard, with a hat, who's building apps that are kind of crappy and only work for their particular use case. They're not thinking about the community. They're not thinking about what they're building. And granted, I am a guy who builds a lot of apps for my own use cases, who wears a hat, who has a beard, but I don't want you to think that that's everybody. Don't think of me as the example. I'm just the guy talking here. But I thought this was an interesting perception, because apparently if you develop enterprise software, you must be doing something absolutely stunningly amazing. And if you use open source software, you must be building crap. That's ridiculous. The other thing about Ruby is people thought it was just for hobbyists. You know, this is still an attitude that people have, which I think is a little ridiculous. Ruby has been around for a while. And don't worry, sit tight, everybody. I'm not going to talk about Ruby the whole time. It's just where we're starting. But I thought this was an interesting perception. This was from a friend of mine who is a longtime developer, had been working in the field, had been a Rubyist, had done many conferences and events that had Ruby involvement, and yet this was still their take on Ruby. You can't use it for anything big. So I challenged him. I said, really? Have you looked at the people who use Ruby? I mean, those are some big names. I'm sure some of you have heard of Netflix. I think it's pronounced Netflix. I know I've heard of Urban Dictionary because I have kids, and the stuff that comes out of their mouth, if I didn't have Urban Dictionary, I would not have any idea what was going on in my house half the time. But, you know, there's also Prompt, which is a mental health and tech platform, Zendesk, Logs.io, Hulu, Bluebox. That's an IBM company. These are all companies that use Ruby and use Rails to extreme success. They do a great job. So obviously Ruby is not for hobbyists. It's not crap. If you do Ruby, enjoy it, have a good time, and embrace your community. Let's talk about the enemy, PHP. So a lot of people have this perception, especially around 2010, 2012 in there, that Ruby and PHP hated each other. I don't know why. I didn't start it. Wasn't me. And I know what my mom always said, doesn't matter if you started, you need to finish it. Okay, so we're going to finish it. So part of the perception was PHP is this like old school web dev language. It's kind of crappy. It used to stand for personal homepage. Like, how good can it be? Whatever. Ruby is the future. Everybody needs to just die. So PHP is dead. F PHP, let it die. We don't care. So this was always to me kind of funny, because even though I haven't been a PHP developer in quite a long time, but I still like PHP. It's very powerful. And if you don't know how powerful it is, this dead language that no one uses, understand that PHP is 70% of the applications you use on the internet. 70% of the applications used on the internet use PHP. Still not sure? Remember Ruby? Remember Rails? Rails has PHP modules in it. It's built into the framework, just so you can integrate and use APIs better. Doesn't matter, that still counts. 70% of the internet runs on PHP. So it's not great, or it's not dead. It is great. It's fine. Sorry, that was my mistake. Some people think that PHP, because it's like a giant, it's using these giant monolithic applications, you can't do microservices. You can't just do anything. It has to be all in one big file, or several pages of files in the way that we used to do things when we were just HTML and CSS and stapling websites to the internet and using marquee tags and things like that. Does anyone else miss the marquee tag? Love the marquee tag. That made me feel like a baller when I started programming. I was like, yeah, I'm gonna have some stuff scrolling at the top. Awesome. But with PHP, people still think like, oh, it has to be monolithic. It has to be one big file or one set of extremely large files. It's got to be terrible. We can't do microservices. Truthfully, with the advent of frameworks, because PHP benefits from frameworks, they've got Cake, they've got Symfony, they have a package manager called Bundler. They're actually able to do that and break out the architecture in the same way any microservices architecture would be used. PHP isn't doing anything different than anyone else. They've just been around a little bit longer. So then I'm going to talk about two concepts, and I'm going to use PHP as an example because it's fun to make fun of PHP. But the first example is slowness. PHP is not responsive. It's an interpreted language. It doesn't have to be built in a compiler. So on the programming side, it's faster, but the whole idea is like, other web languages can be done. They have built-in compilers. They're going to be faster. They're going to give us a better response. How many people know what the expected response rate for any given user of the internet is? Anybody know? Ooh, super quiet. The Danish do not like to talk. Yes, whoever said it, 4 seconds. If I click on a website and it doesn't render in 4 seconds, I hit reload 1 time. If it doesn't come back 4 seconds after that, I've left and gone somewhere else. There's exceptions. You wait for Google, you wait for Netflix, you wait for, Facebook, Meta. I don't know what the hell that thing's called anymore. By the way, built almost completely in PHP. Slowness, when we think of as developers, we're thinking when we look at our terminal and we see that it took 0.009 milliseconds. Well, that's way too long. The end user doesn't even know what that is. They don't even care. We want to see 4-second response time. If you can do that, you're doing pretty good. People want to get their internet as quickly as possible. Then a lot of people always say, oh, PHP lacks security. So this is, am I allowed to swear? I think I already did. So we're going to roll with it. That's bullshit. Any programming language is as secure as you make it. You can honestly use any language you want. And if you're thinking about security and you're focusing on security, you will be successful and have a secure application. If you do not, you will not have a secure application. The language does not matter. Now, there's a weird thing about PHP that I want to bring up, though. So how many people have done PHP before? How many people have gone to a PHP event? Wow, those hands went down fast. Okay, so you three, you know what I'm talking about. The stuffies. I don't get this, but they're really into this. Every event has a different colored stuffy. Every event has and all of these, they mean something that I don't know. And I don't really know what it's about. And I've done this talk a bunch of times, and people have always been like, yo, let us give you a stuffy and maybe you can understand. I'm like, I don't think I want to understand, because all of you are grown adults fighting over friggin' stuffed elephants, and that's just weird. So that's not so big. The key here is PHP still runs about 70% of the internet. Sure, there's different flavors like HHVM, WordPress. How many of you have dealt with WordPress? Sorry. I didn't make it. Again, I didn't start that. Not my fault. But all of it's still PHP at heart. It's still very much exactly what Rasmus wanted to do. And this can lead to some opinionated thoughts like you see here, but it doesn't change the truth of the matter. PHP is strong and PHP is here to stay. So let's talk about something that this is where we get to the controversial part, everybody. You ready? Because we're at GOTO. Java. Java is another language that for some reason, developers, especially young ones, are like, oh man, Java's dead. And then I recently I had a conversation with a young developer who had just gotten out of a boot camp, and they're like, no, I do Java, like JavaScript. And I'm like, no, those aren't the same thing. They're like, no, it is. It says Java in it. Like, well, if you want to get technical, it's ECMAScript, but we're not going to get all into that nomenclature. Trust me, Java and JavaScript aren't the same thing. But Java is still like the super powerful thing that runs so many things. You go back to that idea of you remember the comic with the guy who's like, oh, I build apps to find my coffee in south of Mission in San Francisco. And the other guy's like, I build the stuff that runs the plane. Planes run on Java. When you go into the cockpit, that's running Java. NASA runs Java. If there's things that can magically keep things in the air that aren't really supposed to be in the air, and it's running Java, I'm going to say Java's not dead. I'm going to say Java's doing pretty good out there, and it's completely safe. Space shuttles are pretty sweet. I would like one, but no one's giving that away at the conference. There was a NASA dude who spoke here, and he didn't give anything away. The hell's that about? Python. How many people have used Python? I'm a big fan of Python. I like Python. Python is like, it's kind of in the evolution of developer. It's kind of like where you go after Ruby. So it's not like, nobody's gonna be like, wow, he went from Ruby to Python. That is crazy. Who does that? Everybody. But when Python first came out, the original thinking was this is for academia. This is for studying things. There were things like SciPy and MatPy. They're basically designed for instructors, college courses, things like that. And that was interesting, but people realized they actually could build super powerful analytical applications, which is what a lot of people need, like banks and stuff. Kind of a big deal. So it has this wider application thing, and you wouldn't believe how many crazy things people have done with Python. And this is my favorite. I have two good examples. At a previous job, I used to work at a company called Engineer. Has anybody ever heard of Engineer? That's okay. They're not around anymore, really, because they got rid of me. That's why, to be clear. If you hire me and get rid of me, huge mistake. But seriously, so we built a Python app because we wanted to give back to the open source communities, the open source contributors that were helping build what we were building so much better. So we built this little script so anyone at the company could go in and just fill out a little form, and it would send us a little message in the terminal saying like, oh, Steve wants to donate to Ashley Williams's NPM project because she's doing so much great work. And we would put aside money specifically for her, all done in Python. That's not academic or analytical or scientific. That's just love. We just wanted to make it good. The other good example I have of Python fun is, this is a shot from RailsConf a few years ago. There's a guy named Paul Lemire there. He works at Spotify. I'm sure there's a lot of Spotify users. Think about switching. They don't pay the people who do make the music so well, but that's another talk for another time. But he's on the dev team there, and they use a lot of Python, like a lot of Python. And they developed an app called Boil the Frog. And the idea of Boil the Frog was to take a look at a song, and in 10 steps or less, kind of like the Kevin Bacon thing, you could bring it to another band. You could have one artist connected to another artist. And I was like, okay, Paul, you're such hot stuff. Let's see what you got. I'm going to give you Taylor Swift, which is, hate Taylor Swift. Sorry, everybody. I have opinions. And Amon Amarth. How many people know who Amon Amarth is? Yeah, I knew a few hands would go up. We're in Viking territory. Amon Amarth is a Viking metal band. They sing about pillaging and stuff. It's kind of funny. But how are you going to get from Taylor Swift to Amon Amarth? That's a huge jump. He did it in 6 steps. And all they looked at was, okay, so there's these certain chords there in their song, certain melodies. There's certain, more aggressive tones that come through some of Taylor Swift's music. So they looked at the aggressive songs, and they looked at something like Poppy, she's a weirdo. But she has this really aggressive metal. And then they were looking at Opeth and some other metal bands, and within 6 steps, he got to Amon Amarth. And he was like, that's exactly how it works. And I was like, I agree with everything you just said. This had nothing to do with doing anything scientifically. It was just fun. It was just cool. So Python got out of the academia. We can do away with that idea that Python is just for analytical terms and analytical engines. It can do a lot of fun, powerful stuff. Linux is not a programming language. Shocking. I know everybody try to control your shock. But people always have this perception of Linux that it's neckbeards and basement dwellers. People who are never going to come out of their home. People who are desperately trying to feed all their cats. But how many of you have walked up to a busted bank machine and there's Tux letting you know that the bank machine is rerunning or it's rebooting? How many of you have been on a flight in the last 10 years and someone's screen isn't working, they can't watch Aquaman, which I'm sure is exactly what everyone wants to do, and they were like, we have to reboot the entertainment system. Sorry, they reboot the entertainment system and there's Tux. So when people say Linux is only for people who are doing open source for the sake of open source, Linux has a ton of commercial applications. So we have to do away again with that perception. Linux is enterprise ready. So let's talk about something, this might make a few people groan, but Perl. How many people have done Perl? How many people have done Perl in the last 5 years? All right, you're cool, all right. So I wrote this article a while back when I was working at Engineer about is Ruby dead? Because for some reason in 2014, 2015, everybody's like, is Ruby dead or has it just matured? But they never added the just matured part. They always just said, is Ruby dead? So someone saw that and they were like, is Perl dead? 2014, everybody. That's the day that all of the programming languages died. But ironically, Perl 6 came out that Christmas. And the reason why everyone thought it was dead, because it was kind of like Half-Life 3. For those of you who play video games, Half-Life 3, this is the year of Half-Life 3, I'm sure. But Perl 5 came out, and then it was 5 years of minor point releases and no claim to having a new build. And everyone was like, what's going on? Where's Larry? What is he doing? And what it was is they wanted it to be so good. They wanted it to be so powerful, so safe, so secure, so easy to use. Because boy, if you used Perl before Perl 6, it was not easy to use. A lot of people were like, I kind of like Java. But Perl 6 came out and it was like a gift. It literally came out on Christmas Day. And Larry showed us that you could make it better. You could make it smoother. You just have to take your time, which was a crazy concept in the world of programming languages at the time. Because there was like a JavaScript coming up every day. And that's the problem, is so many people come up with these new ideas. They forget about some of the older things that are actually quite powerful that we can use. We need to do away with those perceptions. So anyway, Jamstack. It's great. It's all you ever need. Don't worry about anything else. Don't worry about programming. Thank you. Have a good night. No? Okay. You got me. That was a falsehood. But you'll hear a lot of people tell you that Jamstack is the future. I tell them that HTML and CSS was the future in 1998 and it's still around. So it's not really the future. But it's not always about the new thing. Perl proved that to us. It could come back after 5 years of dormancy and still be powerful and still be used in a lot of great applications. The new hotness is always the worst thing. And I love this. This is a great example because this tweet came out like years and years ago, but I still love it. This was talking specifically about Swift when Swift came out, which Swift is kind of, in my mind, the precursor to Jamstack. It's like, oh, we've got a great way to easily do open source mobile development. And it wasn't even really open source at the time. But I love the sign because it's like seat reserved for elderly, pregnant passengers, and Objective-C developers. And what they were trying to say is that you didn't need Objective-C anymore. And I was like, what? What? It's one of the most powerful languages in the world. And let's just stop there. We'll put that aside for a second and say, like, we don't need elderly people? Like, these people have so much history. They really know what's happened. Like, we can learn so much from them. And then the real kicker, we don't need pregnant people? Isn't that how we make more people? I mean, I'm not a biologist, but I'm pretty sure that without pregnant people, we are screwed as an entire species. So let's give it up for our Objective-C developers who are still around and still making great, powerful apps. Then there was this whole thing where everything had to have a JS at the end of it. This is kind of still happening. It's like a continuum. But I don't even know what half this stuff does. And I don't want to poop on JavaScript. I don't. I really don't. But like neckbeard.js, I don't know what that does. Doge.js, like, so you can run this and it will put a Doge in your browser when you click, like it's a prank that you play on your coworkers and stuff. Bacon.js, Kraken.js, Phone.js. I don't know what Phone.js does, but I do know what Kraken.js does. It was built by PayPal specifically to search out lost payments, which, okay, that's probably kind of good. And there's great and powerful JavaScript engines out there. There's React, and there's Node, and there's Vue, and if you really want to, there's Angular, I guess, if you're into that kind of scene. But the idea that I'm trying to tell you here is, like, there's so many languages out there. There's so many things you can do that when you lock yourself in and say, I'm a Rubyist, I'm a PHP developer, I'm a Pythonista, you're closing yourself off to other perspectives. Even some of these languages, Go has a problem with, like, it's Go or nothing. It's like, okay, well then it's nothing, I guess, because I want to see what everybody else is doing. There's so many great languages out there. And I know that for those of you who went to the party last night, there was a lot of talk about a lot of these languages. And yes, they all have their drawbacks and they all have their pluses and their minuses, and that's fine. We understand where we work within those parameters. That's what we do as developers. That's the whole point. But the idea is we can't just change things because we want to be with it. We want to be cool. You want to have that hipsterish feeling, like, I'm working at a San Francisco startup and I'm making San Francisco startup money. And, we're making an app that's super cool and tells me where I could go to coffee shops. It's like, what? That's weird. But I don't drink coffee, so I don't really care about that. But we have this perception sometimes as developers that we need to always stay on the bleeding edge of things. But sometimes it actually helps us to take a step back and listen and look and listen to the communities that have built the things that came before. I got in a big argument recently on Twitter. I know, shocking. You've got enough of my personality to probably figure out that obviously I fight people on Twitter, which is super healthy and really good for your mental health. But my point was, people evolve, people move forward. You start as a developer, you do one thing, you learn something, and then it grows out of that. And it doesn't matter if you learned it yourself because you bought a book, or you went to school, you went to university, and you took courses and you have a degree of whatever level. Or you went to a boot camp and you learned in 6 weeks how to do the thing that it took me 6 years to figure out. It doesn't really matter how you learned it. The point is you're here. Now grow from that point. We don't stop learning. So when we stop learning, that we die off as a species, and that species isn't human, that species is developer. We need to continue to learn, and we need to continue to have more perspectives. So what's the best way to do that? Communities. I love communities. I have so much to say about community that I could do it for another like 2.5 hours and you would all be bored silly, especially those of you who've already reclined your seats and are probably feeling pretty relaxed after lunch. But so the idea of community here, and I think this encompasses the way the tech community looks at things now. We could easily say that like these folks in red are the Rubyists and the green folks, that's Go. And I don't know if that's purple or blue. I'm not great with colors. But like that's PHP. And then we have like the JavaScript folks over here, front-end developers, database design, whatever. But I feel like the reason this tells us about the tech community is because it's kind of loosely connected, but everybody's in their own little circle and they're not talking to each other. This is the problem. So I'm going to share with you some things. Like I said, I travel around a lot. I get to go to conferences. Haven't for 18 months. Almost killed me. But here's some things that I actually heard from people as I was traveling around. And these are literal quotes that are not attributed to the people who said them because I don't want to embarrass them. First one, designers aren't developers. They shouldn't be at hardcore tech meetups. You notice I put hardcore tech in quotes because what the hell does that even mean? What is hardcore tech? I don't really know how that's defined. Hardware? Legos? I don't know. Banking applications instead of platform as a service? Cloud development instead of doing it on bare metal? What is hardcore tech? And I'll tell you, there is one thing that I know. I can code pretty well. I'm pretty good at it. I can build a web application, and that web application is going to have black Times New Roman text with a white background because I am no designer. As it is, I don't have to wear the Mattermost shirt. I do it out of the kindness of my heart because they pay me. But I would not be able to like match this with anything other than jeans and this jacket, which I'm still not 100% sure if it matches, but my wife says it does. So I believe her. I can't design stuff. I don't get colors. I'm not good at that. I don't even care about that. I care about functionality. I need a designer to help me. That's some hardcore tech. Man, you see someone who could design CSS out of the top of their head? That's hardcore tech. Don't tell me CSS is not a programming language. You're wrong. Don't tell me HTML is not a programming language. You're wrong. I'm happy to debate that with anybody. Sysadmins can live without developers. What do we need them for? So I used to work at a cloud company. And one of our sysadmins told me this. This is before we used the term DevOps or SRE. It's in the olden times, 5 years ago. And I was stunned, and I looked at him over Skype and said, if there's no developers, what the hell, what system are you administering and for what purpose? If we're not building applications, why do we need sysadmins? And he was like, I never really thought about that. He was just frustrated with the developers because the company we were working at, they were kind of cocky, and we've all worked with those developers like, yo, I'm 10X, bro. I'm so totally ripping this through the shred. It's like, oh my God, shut up. Just stop. There's no such thing as a 10X developer. What you have is a 9X person who can't communicate. But he understood from there. And the interesting thing is after that conversation, he started looking into development. He learned a little bit of Python. He rewrote sed. He rewrote grep for our purposes, learned some bash, went on, and he's now one of the principal engineers at VMware. He doesn't do sysadministration anymore, and he's okay with that. So changed his perspective, but all he had to do was meet some people to talk about it. Business folks just don't get developers. Why do they show up at our meetups, these business folks? It's like, well, you see, developers are good at a lot of things. They're not always great at figuring out what an application needs to do. Business developers often look at the environment, what's going on in the world, they figure it out, they see what's happening, and they can understand what an application needs to do. We absolutely need business developers. And then my favorite one, this is my absolute favorite quote. It's been said so many times, it can be contributed to so many people. Tech people are socially inept, all of them. To which I always respond, did you not hear me talking? I will approach anyone and talk about anything. Are you kidding me? We are not socially inept. That is a bunch of crap. So perceptions, but part of that perception is because we don't look at other perspectives. Cross-pollination. This is the first thing we need to do. We need to stretch out and look outside of our world. So how do we do that? You're a Java developer. Go to the Python meetup. Join it online. It's like super easy now because so many meetups and conferences are online. Super easy to go to another community and just see what they're doing. See what they're talking about. What do they care about? What's important to them? And how can you incorporate that and bring that back to your own community? Cross-pollinate. Go to a design meetup if you've never been a designer. You will, and I guarantee this from personal experience, be a lot confused the first time. You will not really know what's going on because they're using terms you've never heard because you've never really ingrained them, especially if you're a back-end developer. But go and see what they're doing. And if you're a designer, go to a development meetup. See what they're talking about. You will get it. It's going to be a lot easier for you. But the idea is we want to build this awesome tech community. We want to build a greater community that isn't just like, the Ruby community, the PHP community, the Java community, the tech community. We can do these things together. We can build languages. I'm not looking for some like huge overarching theory of unification. I'm just looking to get a little perspective and understand how we can make the thing that I'm doing better because you're doing something a little different. That's what it's about, building these communities. So let's talk about the one elephant in the room that I told you I was going to talk about, we haven't got to. Open source versus the enterprise. Some people think this is a really contentious issue. I've never understood why. The dichotomy between open source and enterprise, or really non-open source software. That's the way you look at it. How many of us are open source developers? How many of you consider yourself non-open source developers or enterprise developers? I feel like not every hand went up, so I'm very confused about what some of you are doing with your lives. But have you ever met anyone who does open source in their spare time but is an enterprise developer in their spare time? Or an enterprise developer in their regular time? You probably know a few people who do open source, like on the side, they check it out, they play around. How many of you know people, this is going to be a lot less people. How many of you know people who do open source for a living and then go and do enterprise software on the side? Yeah, like that's a little less often. But I do know people that like, they want to know, like what's up with Visual Basic? Like what's going on in that world? Is ASP still a thing? Are these Microsoft programming languages? Are people still using them? And they are. So we're going to go back to this guy. So this is the perception. The open source developer is Shaggy, lives in San Francisco. Everybody who does open source in the US, by the way, lives on the West Coast. I live in Buffalo, New York. So we already know that's not true. You make crap apps, or you're living in your mom's basement, scraping together Linux packages because you love Linux so much, and you're just hoping that someone will give you enough money through your GitHub sponsorship that you can pay to feed your 40 cats. That's an open source developer, right? And what's an enterprise developer? Ha ha ha, business. Enterprise developers are always cube dwellers building beige, boring, brown software for other cube dwellers. Because what enterprise developers just, they're cogs in a machine. Open source developers are all hippies. That's the way it works. That's the way the world is. But it's so not true. There's so much we can actually learn from each other if we just get along. Maybe us poor, downtrodden open source developers could learn a little something about organization from the enterprise world. Something about a way to structure our code, a way to organize our teams, a way to use Agile and Scrum to our advantage, even in the open source world, even in projects that don't have an overarching company supporting them. Maybe we can learn that. Maybe enterprise developers can learn a little something about the creativity that you can use in the code that you use, the artisanal sense of crafting code, building something that you're proud of, not something that you're just making because it's your job. There's something to be learned from both those communities, and we can teach each other, but only if we interact, only if we work together. And that's the interesting thing. We need to work together. If we don't, we're just this endless cycle of bullshit. We're making apps to make apps, hoping that someone might use them someday. And that's how you get Facebook. Did I say that out loud? Crap. So what else? So part of the point of this talk is to see that there's flaws in our logic. Not as developers, not in our code. Our code's good. If you're writing tests, that's a different talk altogether. We're people. People are flawed. People have biases. You may not even know that you have biases. You may not even be aware of it. That's the first step. I realized that after being an enterprise developer and becoming an open source developer, I had bias against open source developers. Up until the time that I became one, I was like, man, I don't know about this. Seems kind of shady. Like this is like hackers and stuff. I don't know if I want to get involved in that. Luckily, I went into Ruby and it was like, okay, so that's definitely not what they do. But we need to do our best. Like our whole job, like we try to be useful for 50 to 60 years, right? Assuming that you didn't start working at like 7 years old. 50 or 60 years is what we get. It's the best we can do. Our first step is we take down our biases. We figure out what it is. We try to be as awesome as we possibly can during those 50 to 60 years. But then you get a lot of these like weird perceptions that come from outside of tech, like, yo, we're going to hire you, and you get a LinkedIn notice. You're like, yo, we need a rock star wizard ninja. What the hell is that? As far as I know, wizards aren't real. I'm a big Harry Potter fan, but like wizards aren't real. Y'all know that, right? Rockstar would be someone who is, like those guys last night at the party, up on stage, fucking killing it. Killing it. People are loving it. There's an emotional connection. I have never sat at my computer and written code and been like, there's an emotional connection to everyone who's going to see my code. It doesn't happen. And ninjas, I don't think ninjas are real, but like, to be honest, like ninjas aren't supposed to be seen. And I've never seen one, which either means they're not real or they're doing a really great job. But also, is that what you want to be at work? The person who's not seen? Feels like that's a really bad thing to do. So get rid of that pedestal. We just write code. We think it's a big deal. It is, kind of. It pays the bills. It's fun. It's creative. Get to express some things through it. It's nice. But we're not building a better world. We could be, but we're not. Because we're so wrapped up in like all of the other stuff. We get rid of the biases. So forget the legends. Forget the myths about who you are or what you need to do because you're a coder, you're a developer, you're a designer, you're a database engineer, you're a systems administrator. Forget about everything that's supposed to be because you have this title or you have this identity. Forget about all that. Do your best to like bring people in, teach, mentor, go see other things, get perspective, bring that back to your team, share with them, mentor people who don't look like you. This was tough for me at first because one of the things that you do a lot when you're a coder, especially when you're running a company, you tend to hire people that look exactly like you. It's a human nature. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's what your brain tells you to do. Oh, this person looks like me. They must be like me. I assume they're like me. Let me bring them in. You have to go out of your way to not do that. So when I mentor people, I do a lot of speaker mentoring. I've done code coaching, things like that. I always try to reach out to people who don't look anything like me. Which, given the fact that I'm a, bald, chubby, white guy with a beard in tech, super easy to find someone who doesn't look like me. But there's more. There's more people coming. And the more people we bring in, the better off we are. The more perspectives we get, the better the things that we build. And we're trying to build great things, right? So keep these things in mind. Thank you very much.